The manager publicly punched the billionaire's black husband. Then he begged for mercy, but it was too late. Richard Morrison's fist connected with David's jaw with a crack that echoed through the crowded shopping center. Children screamed, cell phones instantly went up to record, and a circle of onlookers formed around the shocking scene that had just exploded in the food court of the Beverly Center. "Learn to stay in your place," shouted Richard, regional manager of the Platinum fashion chain of stores, adjusting his expensive suit as David staggered backward, his hand instinctively going to his sore face. "People like you shouldn't even be here." David Williams was 34 years old and never imagined that a simple trip to the mall to pick up his wife's birthday present would end with him being publicly assaulted by a man he had never seen before in his life. The metallic taste of blood spread across his mouth as he regained his balance, his dark eyes maintaining a disturbing calm that contrasted with the chaos around him. It had all started 15 minutes earlier, when David had tried to enter the Platinum fashion boutique to buy a bag he had seen online. The security guard at the door, instructed by Richard, had barred him from entering with a "sorry, but this store isn't for your type of customer." When David politely asked what that meant, the situation quickly escalated. "You know exactly what it means," Richard had said, stepping out from behind the counter with an arrogance that made his employees cower. "This is a designer store. Our products cost more than you make in a year. Stop wasting our time and find something more suited to your budget." Now, with half the mall recording and Richard still bragging to onlookers about putting that intruder in his place, David simply wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes revealed a serenity that only exists in those who have faced much worse storms and knew exactly how to survive them. What no one there could have imagined was that this seemingly vulnerable man held a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. And Richard Morrison, in his blind arrogance, had just made the biggest mistake of his entire life. If this story of prejudice and revenge touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple moment of violence would become the catalyst for justice that no one would ever forget. Richard Morrison couldn't stop smiling as he adjusted his tie, feeling like a hero in front of the small crowd that had formed. The circle of onlookers grew by the second, phones pointed to capture every moment of the humiliation he had orchestrated with such pleasure. "Did you see that?" he asked loudly to the spectators, pointing to David, who was still wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth. "That's exactly how we treat intruders here at the Beverly Center. This is an area for people of quality, not for anyone who decides to show up." The store security guard Marcus, a black man in his 50s, looked at the floor with obvious discomfort. He had worked at that mall for 15 years and had never witnessed anything so brutal and unnecessary. But Richard was his boss, and jobs weren't easy to come by at his age. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus tried to intervene discreetly, "maybe we should call mall security to handle this in a more what?" Richard cut him off irritably. "More polite? Marcus, you should be thanking me for protecting our store from undesirable elements. Look at him." He gestured dramatically toward David. "Plain jeans, cheap sneakers, no expensive watch, no sign that he could afford even a wallet from our store. I just saved us from wasting time with someone who obviously has no money." David remained standing in the same spot, his hand still over his bruised face, but his eyes revealed something that bothered Marcus deeply. It wasn't anger, humiliation, or even fear. It was an almost disturbing calm, as if this situation were just another minor obstacle in a much more complex journey. What no one there knew was that David Williams had grown up on the most dangerous streets of Detroit, where surviving to the age of 18 was considered an achievement. At 12, he had already learned that fights were not won with anger, but with intelligence. At 15, he discovered that the most dangerous men were always the quietest. And at 20, when he got his first scholarship, he promised himself that he would never again let gratuitous violence define his destiny. "You know what bothers me the most?" Richard continued his performance for the cell phones recording him, clearly intoxicated by the attention. "It's that arrogance. He really thought he could walk into my store, pretend he had money to buy our products, and we would just accept that lie." An elderly woman in the group of onlookers shook her head in disapproval. "Young man, there was no need to hit the boy. He wasn't doing anything wrong." Richard laughed dismissively. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't understand how the luxury goods business works. We have to protect our real customers from embarrassing situations. Imagine if one of our regular buyers walked into the store and found this." He pointed again at David with obvious disgust. It was at that moment that David finally spoke, his voice low but laden with an authority that made some of the onlookers lean forward to hear better. "Mr. Morrison," David said, pronouncing the name with a precision that made Richard frown, "you are filming this entire situation for your client's social media. Are you sure this is the image Platinum Fashion wants to project?" The question caught Richard off guard. How the hell did this man know his name? He didn't remember introducing himself, and his name tag was hidden under his suit jacket. "How do you know my name?" Richard asked, a slight note of uncertainty coloring his arrogant voice for the first time. David simply smiled, and it was a smile that made Marcus take a step back. It wasn't a smile of submission or fear. It was the smile of someone who had just seen his opponent make exactly the mistake he had been waiting for. "Let's just say I have a habit of finding out about the people I'm going to be interacting with," David replied calmly. "Especially when those people make decisions that can affect the reputation of entire companies." Richard felt an uncomfortable chill run up his spine, but he quickly dismissed the feeling. This was ridiculous. He was the regional manager of one of the most prestigious fashion chains in the country. This man was obviously unemployed or, at best, some store clerk trying to intimidate him with empty words. "You don't scare me," Richard said, but his voice had lost some of its previous conviction. "And if you think you can threaten me after barging into my store, you're sorely mistaken. Marcus, call mall security. I want this man removed from here immediately." But Marcus didn't move. Something in David's gaze had activated all his survival instincts he had developed over decades of working with powerful people. And those instincts were screaming that Richard Morrison had just made a catastrophic mistake. Each new humiliation only strengthened something inside David that his oppressors couldn't see, a silent force fueled by the very injustice they sought to impose. What Richard couldn't imagine was that every insult, every gesture of contempt, was being carefully catalogued in the mind of a man who had turned patience into a lethal weapon over years of meticulous preparation. The crowd around them had grown considerably, with people stopping their shopping to witness the confrontation unfolding in the food court. Richard Morrison felt increasingly confident with all the attention, interpreting the curious glances as approval of his exemplary conduct. "Marcus, you heard what I said," Richard repeated with growing irritation. "Call mall security now. This man clearly poses a threat to our customers and employees." But before Marcus could move, David calmly took his phone out of his pocket. The gesture was so natural and carefree that it made Richard frown with renewed discomfort. "Excuse me," David said politely, dialing a number. "I need to make a quick call." "You're not calling anyone." Richard exploded, trying to grab the phone from David's hands. "Enough of this charade. Security! Security!" David simply took a half step back, keeping the phone out of Richard's reach, and spoke with a calmness that made several people in the crowd lean in to hear better. "Hello, Catherine? It's David. Yes, I'm at the Beverly Center right now. Actually, I'm having a little situation here at Platinum Fashion that I thought you might want to know about." He paused, listening to the response on the other end of the line, while Richard grew redder and redder with anger. "Catherine?" Richard asked loudly, trying to intimidate. "Who the hell is Catherine? His girlfriend? Your mother? Is someone coming to pick you up?" David smiled again with that disturbing serenity. "Catherine Morrison. I believe you two know each other well, Richard. She mentioned that you had lunch together last week." The name hit Richard like a bolt of lightning. Catherine Morrison had been his wife for 15 years, the human resources director of a large technology company. How did this man know Catherine? How did he know about their lunch? "You don't know my wife," Richard said, but his voice had lost all its previous conviction. "That's impossible." "David, honey." A woman's voice echoed across the food court. "Where are you?" "I just got out of the meeting and—" The voice was getting closer. Richard turned toward the voice and felt his legs almost give way. Walking purposefully toward him was Catherine Morrison, his wife, wearing the navy blue executive suit he had helped her choose that morning. Her blue eyes flashed with a mixture of concern and something Richard had never seen before, icy fury. "Catherine." Richard stammered, completely lost. "What are you doing here? How do you know this?" Catherine reached David's side and, without hesitation, wrapped him in a loving embrace that made the entire crowd murmur in surprise. "Are you okay?" "Your voice on the phone." She stopped talking when she saw the cut on the corner of David's mouth and the red mark on his jaw. "Who did this to you?" Catherine asked, her voice low but laden with an authority that made several people around them instinctively step back. David calmly pointed to Richard, who stood frozen, his brain clearly struggling to process the impossibility of what he was seeing. "Richard Morrison, Regional Manager of Platinum Fashion," David said, as if making formal introductions at a business meeting. He decided I didn't have the right profile to enter his store and expressed that opinion with his fists. Catherine slowly turned to face her husband, and Richard felt the whole world crumble around him. The expression on his wife's face was that of someone seeing a complete stranger for the first time. 15 years, Catherine said, her voice so low that only Richard, David, and the people closest to them could hear. 15 years of marriage, and I thought I knew you. Catherine, you don't understand, Richard began desperately. This man broke into my shop, he was aggressive, I was just protecting. Protecting? Catherine interrupted him, her voice rising slightly. Protecting from what? From a man trying to buy a gift for his wife. Marcus, who had watched the entire interaction in growing silence, finally found his voice. Mrs. Morrison, if I may, your husband attacked this gentleman without provocation. I witnessed the entire thing. Mr. David simply wanted to enter the store to make a purchase. Who asked for your opinion, Marcus? Richard growled, but his authority had completely evaporated. You work for me. Actually, a new voice joined the conversation. He works for the mall, which has a contract with Platinum Fashion. A man in a dark suit approached, his badge identifying him as the Beverly Center security supervisor. And we've just received several calls about an assault taking place here. David watched the whole scene unfold with the patience of someone who had orchestrated every movement. Catherine approached him again, her hand finding his with a familiarity that made Richard swallow hard. Richard, Catherine said, her voice now firm and professional, you assaulted David Williams. David Williams, my best friend since college. David Williams, who was the best man at our wedding. David Williams, whose wife Elena has been my business partner for 3 years. Each word was like a hammer blow, and Richard felt his reality shattering. The pieces were beginning to fit together in a terrible, inevitable way. But he was dressed so, Richard began, but stopped as he realized that every word only dug his hole deeper. So what, Richard? Catherine asked. So what? So normal? So like an ordinary person out shopping? Tell me, what crime did he commit other than being black and wearing casual clothes? The crowd around them had grown even larger, and several people were now openly recording, capturing every moment of Richard's humiliation. The security supervisor was talking on his radio, clearly calling for backup. David finally spoke, his voice maintaining the unnatural calm that had characterized the entire interaction. Richard, when you stopped me from entering your store today, and especially when you decided to use physical violence, you made 2 incorrect assumptions. Richard stared at him, unable to speak. First, David continued, you assumed that I didn't have the money or connections to shop at your store. Second, you assumed I didn't have the power to defend myself. He paused, letting the words sink in. Both assumptions were inadequate. Catherine squeezed David's hand, and Richard could see years of friendship and mutual trust in that simple gesture. Everything he thought he knew about his wife, about his own life, was being rewritten before his eyes. What you don't know, Richard, David said softly, is that Catherine and I have known each other for 20 years. She helped me get my first scholarship. I introduced her to the man she married. He looked directly into Richard's eyes. You. The revelation hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. The woman he had been married to for 15 years was the longtime best friend of the man he had just humiliated and assaulted in public. But as Richard struggled to process this devastating information, David made a move no one expected. He took a small digital recorder out of his pocket and turned it off with an audible click. Catherine, David said calmly, do you remember that conversation we had about documenting instances of racial discrimination for Elena's research project? Well, I just collected a particularly enlightening example. It was when everyone laughed that something unexpected began to take shape, not just in the room, but mainly in the determined look that now shone with an intensity that made some of those present realize that something extraordinary was about to happen. The digital recording that David had turned off so casually seemed to echo in the tense silence that settled over the food court. Richard Morrison felt cold sweat trickling down his back as he processed the magnitude of what he had just discovered. He had assaulted his own wife's best friend. Catherine, Richard stammered, trying to regain some control of the situation. You can't be serious. This man. He broke into my store, he was aggressive, I was just... aggressive. Catherine interrupted, her voice rising dangerously. David, show me exactly where Richard was aggressive toward you. David simply pointed to the still bleeding cut on the corner of his mouth and the red mark on his jaw. The physical evidence of the assault was undeniable, captured by dozens of cell phones that were still recording. 15 years, Richard, Catherine repeated, her voice now shaking with contained rage. 15 years I've listened to you talk about values, about treating people with respect, about being a man of character. She paused, looking around at the crowd that had gathered. And in a single moment, you've revealed who you really are. The mall security supervisor approached, accompanied by 2 police officers who had just arrived. Mr. Morrison, we need to talk about the assault that was reported. Richard felt the world spinning around him. You don't understand. I'm the regional manager for Platinum Fashion. I have responsibilities, authority. A new voice cut through the air. An elegant man in his 50s approached the group. His presence commanded immediate attention, and even in the curious crowd, people respectfully moved aside to make way. Mr. Crawford. Richard said, his voice coming out as a strangled whisper. James Crawford was the executive vice president of Platinum Fashion, his direct boss, and one of the most powerful people in the company. Richard, Crawford said, his voice as cold as Arctic ice, I've just received several calls about an incident involving one of our managers assaulting a customer in public. He gestured toward the cell phones still recording. An incident that apparently is being broadcast live on social media across half of Beverly Hills. David stepped forward, extending his hand to Crawford with a smile that made Richard's stomach sink even further. James, David said warmly, how nice to see you here. Although I wish it were under more pleasant circumstances. Crawford shook David's hand with genuine respect and something that looked very much like concern. David, my God, are you okay? When I heard that one of our employees had assaulted you. Richard watched in growing horror as his boss treated David as an equal, no, as someone higher up in the social and corporate hierarchy. Mr. Crawford, Richard tried desperately to intervene, you don't understand the situation. This man tried to enter our store without the proper profile, he was being... Shut up, Crawford growled, turning to Richard with a fury that made several people around them recoil. You just publicly assaulted David Williams. David Williams, Richard. The name was spoken with such reverence and horror that it caused the crowd to murmur in confusion. Who was David Williams that he deserved such a reaction? David kept his expression calm, but Catherine could see the amused gleam in his eyes. He was clearly enjoying every second of the gradual revelation. Richard, Crawford continued, his voice shaking with anger, you assaulted the CEO and founder of Williams Tech Solutions. The company that provides all of our systems infrastructure, our payment processing, our cybersecurity. He paused to let that sink in. The company that has a 5-year exclusive contract with us, worth $47 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt his legs give out, and he grabbed the nearest chair to keep from collapsing. Impossible, Richard muttered. He was dressed like a normal person doing weekend shopping? David suggested gently. Strange concept, isn't it, Richard? Marcus, the security guard who had witnessed everything, finally found his voice. Mr. Williams, I'm so sorry. If I had known who you were. David turned to Marcus with a genuinely kind smile. Marcus, you did nothing wrong. In fact, you've shown more professionalism and dignity in the last 10 minutes than your boss has in his entire career. Crawford pulled out his cell phone and began dialing frantically. I need to call the company president immediately. David, please tell me we can work this out. James, David said calmly, I'm not a vindictive person. But your employee not only physically assaulted me, he did so based purely on racial and class prejudice, in public, while representing your company. He gestured to the cell phones still recording. This isn't just about me. It's about the message Platinum Fashion is sending to the world. Catherine watched her husband break down in real time. The man she had been married to for 15 years was revealing a side of his personality she had never seen, or perhaps never wanted to see. Richard, she said softly, David isn't just my best friend. He's our children's godfather. He was at our wedding. He helped me get my first job. Her voice broke slightly. How could you do this to him? One of the officers approached Richard. Sir, we need you to come with us to give a statement about the assault. Several people recorded the incident. Wait, Richard pleaded, turning to David with growing desperation. Please, you don't understand. I have a family, children, a career. This was a terrible misunderstanding. David studied him for a long moment, his expression inscrutably calm. Richard, I'm going to ask you a simple question. If I were really who you thought I was, a black man with no money or connections, would you feel the same need to apologize? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Richard opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly struggling with a response that everyone already knew. That's exactly it, David said softly. You're only sorry because you found out I can fight back. Not because you recognize that what you did was fundamentally wrong. Crawford hung up the phone, his face pale. David, I spoke with our president. Obviously, Richard is fired, effective immediately. But about our contract. David smiled, and it was a smile that made Richard feel as if the world was falling out from under his feet. James, interesting that you should mention that. You see, I was actually coming here today to discuss the early renewal of our contract. I was thinking of expanding our services, perhaps doubling the value of the agreement. Richard's heart stopped. If Platinum Fashion lost Williams Tech Solutions, it wouldn't just be him who suffered, it would be a corporate disaster that would affect hundreds of jobs. I've been thinking, David continued casually, but now I need to consider whether I want to continue to be associated with a company whose employees find it acceptable to assault customers based on the color of their skin. Crawford looked like he was on the verge of a heart attack. David, please, this was a rogue employee acting on his own. The company does not tolerate. The company promoted that rogue employee to regional manager, David observed. The company gave him the authority to represent its values. The company trained him, supervised him, evaluated him positively for years. He paused. That makes me wonder what other rogue employees might be in leadership positions. Richard finally understood the full magnitude of what he had done. Not only had he destroyed his own career, he had potentially damaged the entire company, all of his colleagues, hundreds of families who depended on those jobs. Please, Richard whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. I beg you. My children, my wife. Catherine recoiled from him in disgust. Don't use me as an excuse for your actions, Richard. What about our children? She paused, looking directly into his eyes. They deserve to know who their father really is. As the police officers approached to take Richard away, David did something no one expected. He approached the man who had assaulted him and spoke quietly so that only Richard could hear. Richard, I'm going to give you some free advice. Use this moment to really reflect on who you are and who you want to be. Because the person you revealed yourself to be today is not someone your own children should look up to. That's when the true magnitude of the destruction Richard had caused began to sink in, not just in his professional world, but in something even more fundamental and irreversible. 6 months later, David Williams walked through the same Beverly Center where it all had happened. The former Platinum Fashion store was closed, with a space available for rent sign plastered across the dusty window. Williams Tech Solutions had canceled the multimillion-dollar contract, causing a domino effect that resulted in the closure of 3 stores in the area. James Crawford had managed to keep only the downtown locations open, laying off 200 employees in the process. Richard Morrison, meanwhile, found that finding a job in retail after a viral video of racial assault was no easy task. His own wife, Catherine, had filed for divorce, taking the children to live with her sister in another state. I can't look at you anymore without seeing the man who assaulted my best friend, she said during their last conversation. Marcus, the former store security guard, now worked at Williams Tech Solutions headquarters as a security coordinator, with a salary 3 times higher and health insurance for his entire family. Mr. Williams gave me a chance when no one else believed in me, he told his colleagues, still incredulous at the turnaround in his life. David stopped in front of the place where Richard had assaulted him, watching families of all colors shopping peacefully. His company now sponsored a scholarship program for young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged communities, turning that moment of pain into fuel for real change. His cell phone vibrated with a message from Catherine. David, thank you for helping me see who Richard really was. The kids asked if you're coming to Sophie's 10th birthday party next month. He smiled as he typed back, "I wouldn't miss it for the world. Godfather always present." The best revenge, David had learned, was not to destroy those who hurt him, but to build something greater than his oppressors could ever imagine. Richard tried to humiliate him for his color and apparent social status, but ended up revealing his own smallness to the whole world. If you've ever faced prejudice or injustice, remember, your dignity is your greatest strength, and success is always the most eloquent response. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that those who sow prejudice reap consequences.